There's someone reading this who woke up today exactly like yesterday, and the day before, and every day for the last several months. They're not unhappy. That would be simpler, actually, because unhappiness pushes you to do something about it. Instead, they're stuck in that strange zone where nothing is acutely wrong, but nothing feels right either. Work happens. They show up. They get paid. Then they come home, and the evening happens the same way it always does. And by the time they fall asleep, they've got that low-level dread that this is what the next 10 years will look like. If you're reading this, you probably know exactly what I'm describing, because you've lived in that zone long enough to recognize its contours. You've tried the obvious fixes. You've read the books that tell you to wake up at 5 in the morning, visualize success, find your why, repeat affirmations like they're magic words that unlock a door you didn't even know existed. Some of those things worked. For a while. You got the burst of energy, made some changes, felt different for maybe 3 weeks or 6 weeks. And then something shifted. The energy evaporated. The discipline became harder to find. The new habits that felt revolutionary suddenly felt like obligations. And obligations are just another flavor of exhaustion. Here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. This isn't a sign that you're weak or unmotivated or lazy. It's not that you're doing motivation wrong or you need to find the right system this time. What's actually happening is that the architecture of motivation itself has changed inside you. And continuing to operate using the same old principles feels like trying to drive a car using instructions designed for a horse and buggy. The system worked fine when you were younger because your brain, your body, your obligations, and your understanding of what life required from you were all aligned in a relatively simple configuration. At 45 or 50, that alignment has fractured. Around this point in the conversation, people usually ask me if I'm saying they should just give up and accept stagnation. That's where the misunderstanding typically lives. I'm not telling you that change is impossible, or that you're destined to feel this way forever. I'm telling you that the primary tool you've been using to create change, motivation, is no longer the right tool for the job. Continuing to rely on it is like being a surgeon who only has a hammer in their toolkit and wondering why the operation isn't going well. The hammer was useful once. It's not useful now. You need something else entirely. This book is built on a different premise than most of the self-help material you've probably encountered. Rather than trying to convince you that motivation is still somewhere inside you if you just dig deep enough, or that the secret is to want things more intensely, I'm going to walk you through what actually happens in your nervous system when motivation stops working the way it used to. You're going to understand the neuroscience of why the strategies that worked at 30 fail at 50. You're going to see that what feels like personal weakness is actually your brain and body doing exactly what they're supposed to do at this stage of life, which is to demand something deeper and more real from you than a manufactured sense of urgency ever could provide. Throughout this audiobook, you'll follow the journey of Michael, a 47-year-old executive at a tech company who hit this wall hard. He had the career that looked good from the outside. He had the credentials and the title and the paychecks that supposedly meant he was winning. He also had the distinct sensation of going through the motions, of being a very good actor in someone else's production of his life. When his motivation finally bottomed out, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had switched off a light, he thought it meant he was finished. This book traces what happened next, which wasn't a dramatic turnaround, but rather a fundamental shift in how he understood what was actually possible in the second half of life. You're going to hear about the psychological mechanisms that activate in middle age, the ones that nobody tells you about because they don't sell courses or coaching packages. You're going to learn practical tools that don't require you to become a different person or completely reorganize your life around productivity. And you're going to get a clear answer to the question that probably brought you here in the first place. Is it really not too late? Or is that just something people say to make you feel better? By the end of this book, you won't have found a magical new form of motivation. You'll have discovered something more useful and more durable, a way to generate sustainable change that doesn't depend on you feeling inspired or driven or like you're on fire with conviction. You'll understand that where you are right now isn't a dead end or a failure state. It's actually an opening, if you know how to recognize it and what to do with it. The journey starts with understanding what's actually broken, and it turns out that nothing you've been blaming yourself for is actually the problem. Ready to find out what is? Chapter 1. Myth Number 1. Motivation is a choice. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone in their 40s when they're sitting at their desk or driving home from work, and they realize something has gone quiet inside them. Not the good kind of quiet, the kind where you're calm and centered, the empty kind, the kind where you try to summon up the feelings that used to work, the drive, the hunger, the sense that something important is waiting for you if you just push hard enough, and nothing comes back. You reach for the lever that used to start the engine, and the engine doesn't turn over. And immediately, before you've even fully processed what's happening, your mind goes to the same place it always goes. Something is wrong with me. This is where the first myth takes root, the one that's going to poison your entire understanding of what's actually happening. The myth is simple and seductive because it puts you in control. It says that motivation is a choice. According to this framework, there are people who choose to be motivated, and there are people who choose not to be. And the difference between those two categories of people is willpower or character or wanting it badly enough. If you're sitting there feeling unmotivated, the logic goes, then you've made a choice, whether consciously or unconsciously, not to be. And if it's a choice, then it's your fault. And if it's your fault, then theoretically, you can unchoose it. You can wake up tomorrow and decide differently. The reason this myth survives is because it's partially true, which is the most dangerous kind of false belief. Motivation does have a choice component to it, but only at the edges. You can choose to go to the gym even when you don't feel like it. You can choose to have a difficult conversation even when you'd rather avoid it. You can choose to work on your project even when you'd rather scroll through your phone. These are real choices, and making them does require some form of internal decision-making. But here's where the myth breaks down. The energy you need to make these choices. The raw fuel that allows your brain to override its default settings and do something that requires effort. That's not a choice. That's a function of your nervous system, your hormone levels, your sleep quality, your overall life load, and 100 other biological and circumstantial factors that you don't get to vote on. The confusion happens because people conflate two completely different things. They see someone who keeps showing up even when it's hard, and they assume that person has access to some wellspring of motivation that other people lack. But what they're actually seeing is someone whose particular configuration of biology, circumstances, and life stage makes it relatively easy to generate the energy that motivation requires. That person might genuinely believe they're just choosing harder or wanting it more than everyone else. They have no way of knowing what it would feel like to be in a different biological or circumstantial situation because they've never been there. It's like being born into a wealthy family and assuming that people who are poor just aren't choosing hard enough to be rich. This is where your 40s and 50s become crucial. Your neurobiology has shifted. Your body is producing different amounts of certain hormones. Your nervous system has developed patterns over decades. Your responsibilities have usually multiplied. You might be supporting aging parents, managing teenagers or adult children, carrying the weight of a mortgage and a career and a marriage or relationship that requires constant maintenance. You're not a worse person than you were at 25. You're not lazier or weaker. You're operating under a completely different set of biological conditions and external demands. But you're still measuring yourself against the standards of someone in their 20s or 30s who had different biology and a fundamentally simpler life. Here's what most people don't understand about motivation at this life stage. The energy you have is finite, and it's getting allocated constantly. Some of it goes to work, some goes to family and relationships, some goes to managing your health, paying your bills, dealing with your obligations. By the time you've been awake for a few hours, you've already spent enormous amounts of your available energy, and you haven't even gotten to the part where you're supposed to be pursuing your personal goals or your dreams. The motivation you're looking for isn't hiding somewhere inside you, waiting to be chosen. It's been rationed out in microscopic pieces to the 20 different demands on your attention. There's no choice in that equation. There's just allocation. Now here's where understanding this actually matters. If motivation were truly a choice, then the solution would be straightforward. Choose better. But it's not. Which means all the times you've told yourself you need to choose harder or want it more, you've been giving yourself impossible instructions. You can't choose to want something more than you want it. You can't choose to manufacture energy that your body isn't producing. And the moment you realize this, something shifts. The guilt starts to dissolve. Not because you're off the hook, you're never completely off the hook in life, but because you're no longer operating under a false premise about what the problem actually is. The first step in getting unstuck is recognizing that you're not broken because you can't choose to feel differently about your goals or your life. You're in a different phase of existence with different biochemistry and different constraints. And treating yourself as though you're just a worse version of your younger self is not a strategy that's ever going to work. What you need instead is to understand what's actually true about motivation at your stage of life, so that you can stop blaming yourself for not having access to something that you were never meant to have in the first place. Chapter 2. Myth number 2. Willpower is enough. There's a particular brand of exhaustion that comes from believing that willpower is the main variable in the equation of personal change. You wake up and you decide that today is the day you're going to be different. You're going to have discipline. You're going to push through the resistance. You're going to be the kind of person who does what needs to be done, regardless of how they feel about it. And for a few hours, maybe even a few days, it actually works. You feel the surge of that force inside you, that determination, that sense of control. You're doing the thing. You're making it happen. And then something happens. You get tired or frustrated, or life throws an actual problem at you that requires your attention. And the willpower evaporates like it was never real in the first place. Most people interpret this as a personal failure. They think they didn't want it badly enough, or they weren't disciplined enough, or they didn't have the mental fortitude that other people seem to have in abundance. What they don't realize is that they're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of what willpower actually is and how it works in the human body and brain. Willpower isn't a character trait. It's not something you either have or don't have in fixed quantities. It's a neurological resource, a specific type of energy that your brain uses when it needs to override your default impulses and do something that requires effort or resistance. And like all resources, it gets depleted. The problem is that by the time you reach your middle years, you've been spending willpower on things that younger people don't have to spend it on. You've spent willpower maintaining your career. You've spent willpower managing your relationships and your family obligations. You've spent willpower dealing with the cumulative stress of decades of adult responsibilities. You've spent willpower on things that don't even feel like they require willpower anymore, because they've become so automatic that you do them without thinking. But the expenditure still happens at a neurological level. Your brain is still using that resource, even when you're not aware of it. Consider what a typical day looks like for someone in their mid-40s or 50s. You wake up, and immediately your nervous system is activated by the knowledge that there are things that need to be done. Work is waiting. There are emails that need to be answered. There are decisions that need to be made. There are people who are depending on you to show up and perform in a particular way. Just navigating through the morning, deciding what to wear, what to eat, how to respond to the situations that present themselves. All of that is using your willpower reserves. Then you go to work, or you start your day. And now you're using willpower to maintain focus when there are dozens of distractions. You're using willpower to be patient in a meeting when you're frustrated. You're using willpower to make decisions about things that matter and things that don't. By lunchtime, you've already spent an enormous amount of willpower, and you haven't even gotten to the part where you're supposed to be making time for yourself or pursuing your personal goals. Then, and this is the part that really matters, you come home or you finish your workday, and now there's the second shift. If you have a family, there are people who need your attention. If you live alone, there's the maintenance of your living space, the management of your health, the basic logistics of keeping yourself alive and functional. You need to eat dinner. You probably need to do something that resembles exercise. You probably need to sleep at some point. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, you're supposed to find the willpower to also pursue the goals that actually matter to you. The projects that make you feel like your life has meaning. The things that would make you feel like you're moving forward rather than just maintaining. Here's the mathematical reality that nobody wants to talk about. There is not enough willpower in a human body to do all of those things simultaneously, especially not when you're already depleted from decades of responsibility. The willpower that theoretically exists inside you is already allocated to critical functions. The idea that you can access more of it by just trying harder is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how your nervous system works. It's like looking at your bank account and seeing that you have $10, and then being told that the reason you can't buy a $1,000 item is because you just don't want it badly enough. The problem isn't your desire or your willpower. The problem is that you're running a deficit. What makes this even more complicated is that willpower doesn't just deplete. It actually becomes less efficient the more you try to use it in the context of chronic stress or exhaustion. Your brain prioritizes survival and stability. When you're operating under chronic stress, your brain's main objective is to conserve energy and maintain homeostasis. It's trying to keep you safe and stable, not help you pursue ambitious personal projects. Asking your willpower to override that basic survival instinct is like asking a soldier who's in the middle of a battle to stop and do some creative writing. Technically possible, but fighting against every impulse your nervous system has. This is where people often get confused about what the solution to low willpower actually is. The standard advice is usually some version of build better habits, or start smaller, or find accountability partners. These are not bad suggestions. They can be useful. But they're built on the assumption that if you just deploy willpower more strategically, you can make it work. And that's still operating under the same flawed premise. The issue isn't that you need to use your willpower better. The issue is that you're asking willpower to do a job it was never designed to do, which is to be your primary engine of change and motivation over the long term. By the time you reach the age where you're reading a book about why motivation has stopped working, you've probably already discovered this truth through hard experience. You've tried, you've pushed, you've deployed your willpower again and again, and it's worked for a few weeks or months. And then you've crashed. You've felt the exhaustion that comes from fighting against your own nervous system's attempts to conserve energy. You've experienced the deep fatigue that results from trying to generate change through pure force of will when you're already depleted. And then you've blamed yourself for not being able to sustain it. When the real issue is that willpower was never the right tool for this particular job. The people who seem to maintain effortless discipline aren't actually relying on superior willpower. They're operating under different conditions. They might have less chronic stress. They might have fewer competing obligations. They might have a life structure that doesn't require constant willpower expenditure just to maintain basic functioning. Or they might have figured out, sometimes consciously, sometimes by accident, how to stop trying to use willpower as their primary engine, and instead structure their life in a way that makes the desired behavior the path of least resistance, rather than constant struggle. They've found a way to make what they want to do also what's easiest to do. And that's a completely different mechanism than willpower. The insight that starts to shift things is understanding that willpower depletion isn't a sign that you're weak or undisciplined, or that you need to try harder. It's actually feedback from your body telling you something important. The system you're trying to run isn't sustainable. You're trying to maintain too many things simultaneously using a resource that's already depleted. And the solution isn't to find more willpower or develop better willpower. The solution is to fundamentally change the game, to stop relying on willpower as your primary tool for generating change, and instead find mechanisms that work with your nervous system rather than against it. Understanding this distinction is crucial because it changes everything about how you approach the next phase of your life. Instead of beating yourself up for not having enough willpower, you can start asking the real question. What would need to be different about my life structure, my environment, my daily patterns, for the things I want to do to also be the things that are easiest for me to do? That's a much more productive question, and it leads to solutions that actually last rather than solutions that work for a few weeks until you crash again. Chapter 3. Myth number 3. You just need to want it bad enough. This is the myth that sits at the intersection of inspiration and cruelty. It's the myth that gets repeated in locker rooms and boardrooms and self-help seminars across the country, usually by someone who has successfully changed something about their life, and is now convinced that the reason they succeeded was because they wanted it more than other people want things. The myth goes like this. If you're not getting what you want, it's because deep down, you don't actually want it as much as you claim to want it. If you really wanted it, if you truly, deeply wanted it with every fiber of your being, you would find a way to make it happen. The underlying logic is that desire is the primary driver, and insufficient results mean insufficient desire. This particular myth is especially dangerous for people in middle age because it arrives carrying a heavy burden of guilt and self-judgment that wasn't there when you were younger. When you were 30 and you didn't accomplish something, you could still blame external circumstances. You could tell yourself you'd try again next year. You could imagine that this was just a temporary setback and that the future was still wide open. But by the time you're in your 40s or 50s, the future feels less infinite. You've already lived long enough to see patterns in your own behavior. You've already tried and failed at enough things to start wondering whether the problem really is that you don't want things badly enough. The trap of this myth is that it's actually built on a grain of truth. Desire does matter. You probably won't achieve something if you're completely indifferent to it. But somewhere between complete indifference and wanting something with an intensity that borders on obsession, there's a vast middle ground where most of actual human life happens. Most of the things that are worth doing don't require you to want them with passion that consumes your every thought. Most of them just require that you want them more than you want the alternative, or that you've decided they matter enough to allocate your limited time and energy to them. Here's what the myth misses. Wanting something and being able to act on that want are not the same thing. Wanting is a function of your values, your imagination, your hopes, the internal landscape of what matters to you. Acting is a function of your energy, your time, your competing obligations, the current state of your nervous system, and the structural realities of your life. A person can want something with genuine intensity and still not be able to do it because they're exhausted or because the logistics of their existence make that particular action impossible in the moment. Crucially, a person can want something and discover that they want something else more. And that discovery doesn't mean they didn't want the first thing. It just means they made a choice about what matters most, given their actual constraints. By midlife, your life has become complicated in ways that your younger self couldn't have predicted. Your job might pay well, but demands so much of your energy that there's nothing left when you come home. Your relationships require constant maintenance and compromise. You're supporting family members who depend on you, aging parents, maybe children who aren't quite launched. You're dealing with health issues, financial obligations, the accumulated weight of decades of responsibility. None of these things mean you don't want enough. They just mean that your life is more constrained than a simple want-to-action formula allows for. And the gap between what you want and what you can actually do has widened significantly. The cruelty of this myth becomes apparent when you start believing it about yourself. If you internalize the idea that failure to act means insufficient desire, then every time you don't accomplish something you wanted to accomplish, you're not just dealing with the disappointment of the outcome. You're also dealing with the deeper shame of believing that you apparently didn't want it badly enough. It becomes self-reinforcing. You want something, you don't accomplish it. You conclude that you must not have wanted it enough, and now you feel both disappointed and weak. The myth converts a logistical problem, not having enough time or energy or structural support, into a character problem, which is far more painful and far more durable. What becomes true over time, when you've lived long enough to see this pattern repeat, is that the myth starts to feel accurate. You start to notice that the things you actually accomplish are the things that somehow fit into your life without requiring massive reorganization, while the things you don't accomplish are the things that would require you to rearrange significant pieces of your existing commitments. And so the conclusion seems obvious. You must want the things you accomplish more than you want the things you don't accomplish. But that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is that you're naturally gravitating toward doing the things that don't require you to overcome massive resistance, that don't demand you sacrifice something else that also matters. You're naturally conserving your limited energy and deploying it toward the path of least resistance, which is exactly what any intelligent organism does when resources are scarce. The insight that starts to change everything is recognizing that the intensity of wanting something is not a reliable predictor of whether you'll do it. Some of the most important things you've ever done in your life, you probably didn't want to do at the moment you were doing them. You might have wanted the outcome desperately, but the actual action felt like work, like you were pushing against resistance. Some of the things you thought you wanted intensely turned out not to fit into your actual life, and so you let them go, which felt like failure but was actually just a recalibration based on reality. Some of the things you're doing right now that feel successful or satisfying are things you probably would have thought you didn't want badly enough if you'd predicted your current situation a few years ago. This is where the people in their middle years often get stuck, waiting for desire to be intense enough that it overrides all the resistance, all the obstacles, all the competing demands on their time. They're waiting for the day when they'll want something so badly that it will automatically translate into action, when in reality, that day usually doesn't come. Not because they don't have the capacity to want things intensely, but because the intensity of wanting doesn't actually convert directly into the ability to act when your life is already operating at full capacity. The waiting itself becomes a form of procrastination, and the myth gives you something to blame: your insufficient desire, while you continue to do nothing, which feels safer than admitting that your life simply doesn't have room for this thing you want. The version of this myth that's particularly insidious in middle age is the idea that if you want something badly enough, you'll find the time. As if time is something hidden somewhere that you just need to search harder to locate. Time isn't found. It's allocated. It comes from somewhere in your existing life, which means that taking time for a new project means taking it away from something else. That something else is probably something that also matters: your health, your relationships, your work, your rest. So the real question isn't whether you want it badly enough. The question is whether you want it badly enough compared to everything else you're already committed to and responsible for. That's a much more honest and much more useful question to ask yourself, because it acknowledges that you're operating within real constraints rather than pretending that sufficient desire will somehow magic away the physics of a 24-hour day. What changes when you stop believing this myth is that you stop waiting for some internal transformation of desire to solve an external structural problem. You stop thinking that you need to psych yourself up or want something with white-hot intensity or find some deep reservoir of commitment buried somewhere inside you. Instead, you start thinking about what would actually need to be different about your life, your time, your energy, your obligations, your daily environment, your support system, for the thing you want to also be the thing that makes sense to do. That's a completely different conversation than the one the myth has you having with yourself, and it's one that actually leads somewhere productive. Chapter 4. Michael's Story. When everything stopped working. Michael was the kind of person who made it look easy, not in an obnoxious way. He wasn't the guy who bragged or demanded attention. He was just quietly successful in a way that felt inevitable, like someone whose life had been set on the right track early and had simply stayed there. At 47, he was a senior director at a mid-sized tech company in the Bay Area. The kind of position that comes with a six-figure salary, stock options, and the kind of responsibility that means your decisions affect hundreds of people. He had gotten there through the standard formula: good grades, the right school, the right moves at the right time, working harder than his peers, showing up earlier and staying later than anyone else expected. He had built a reputation as someone you could count on, someone who delivered, someone who had his act together. By the time he hit his mid-40s, Michael had accumulated the kind of life that was supposed to feel satisfying. He had been married for 19 years to a woman named Sarah, and while their relationship had its predictable stresses, the compromises that come with decades of shared living, the way passion gradually transforms into something more like comfortable obligation. They had built something stable. They had 2 kids in college, which meant their house had finally become quieter, but also more expensive, because tuition bills arrive like clockwork and there's nothing you can do but pay them. He had a house in a decent neighborhood, the kind of house that required constant maintenance and lawn care and small repairs that never quite felt finished. He had friends, not as many as he'd had in his 30s, but quality people he still saw occasionally. Though increasingly those occasions were scheduled months in advance because everyone's calendars were packed. What Michael didn't have, though he wouldn't have admitted this to anyone and barely admitted it to himself, was the sense that any of this was actually happening to him. His life felt like something he was observing from a distance, like he was watching an actor play the role of Michael rather than actually being Michael. He would walk into his office in the morning and go through the motions of his job, attending meetings, making decisions, responding to emails, and it all felt correct and appropriate and completely hollow. He was performing the role of someone who knew what he was doing and cared about the outcomes, when in reality he had begun to feel like he was moving through his days on autopilot, making the right moves in the right sequence without any actual engagement with what was happening. The strange part was that nothing had gone dramatically wrong. There was no crisis, no betrayal, no sudden loss. The company was doing well. His performance reviews were solid. His marriage wasn't on the rocks. His kids were healthy and doing okay in college. By every external measure, his life was working. And yet, somewhere deep inside, something had simply stopped. The thing that had propelled him forward for decades. The sense that he was building towards something, that his work mattered, that if he just kept pushing and delivering and showing up, something meaningful would eventually happen, had evaporated. In its place was just a kind of grayness, a flatness, a profound lack of interest in whether any of it actually happened or not. Michael first noticed it on a Tuesday morning. He was sitting in his car in the parking lot at work, and he realized that he couldn't remember driving there. He had no memory of the commute, no recollection of the decision to leave his house, no sense of the passage of time from when he'd woken up to when he'd arrived at his destination. His mind had been somewhere else entirely, or more accurately, his mind had been nowhere, completely absent, running on some kind of autopilot subroutine while the rest of him went through the physical motions. That might have been just an isolated incident, except that it started happening more frequently. He would finish entire meetings and have almost no recollection of what had been discussed. He would drive home and then realize that he couldn't account for the last hour of his day. Around the same time, Michael realized that his relationship with motivation had fundamentally changed. Not gradually. It wasn't like he had been slowly losing interest in things. It was more like someone had switched off a light. For decades, motivation had been his default state. He wanted to succeed at work, so he pushed himself to be excellent at it. He wanted to stay in shape, so he made himself go to the gym even on days when he didn't feel like it. He wanted his marriage to be solid, so he made effort, even when effort felt like work. He wanted to be a good father, so he showed up and invested time even when he was exhausted. All of those wants had been there, and they had been enough to move him forward. They had been reliable. They had worked. But now, when he tried to access that motivational drive, it was like trying to start a car with a dead battery. He would think about the things he was supposed to want: success at work, maintaining his health, being a good husband and father. And intellectually, he knew that he should care about these things. Emotionally, though, there was nothing there. The feeling didn't come. The desire didn't activate. And what was worse was that he couldn't seem to manufacture it, no matter what he tried. He would read articles about achieving more. He would watch videos about peak performance. He would tell himself that he just needed to want it badly enough, to find some deeper source of commitment, to remember why these things had mattered to him in the first place. None of it worked. He was standing in his own life, unable to feel interested in it. This is when the shame started to creep in. Michael had been taught his entire life that motivation came from inside you, that it was something you generated through effort and discipline and choosing to care about the right things. The fact that he couldn't generate it meant something was wrong with him, not with his circumstances, not with the structure of his life, but with him as a person. He started to wonder whether he was depressed, though he didn't have the kind of symptoms he associated with depression. He wasn't lying in bed, unable to get up. He wasn't actively suicidal. He was just empty. He was functioning, doing his job, going through the social rituals, but there was no one home inside. And the shame of not being able to fix that through willpower or positive thinking or any of the standard motivational techniques made him feel weak and defective. He tried the things you're supposed to try. He increased his exercise routine, thinking that maybe the problem was that he wasn't taking care of his body. He started going to the gym 5 days a week instead of 3, pushing himself harder, trying to recreate that sense of physical accomplishment that he remembered from earlier in his life. It didn't change anything. He was exhausted all the time, but the exhaustion was different now. It wasn't the good kind of tired that comes from effort and accomplishment. It was a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. He tried changing his diet, cutting out caffeine, getting to bed earlier. His sleep got slightly better, but the flatness didn't lift. He considered therapy, but something in him resisted it. Not because he was opposed to therapy in principle, but because he felt like if he admitted to a therapist that he couldn't generate basic motivation, he would have to admit that something fundamental was broken. What Michael was experiencing, though he wouldn't have known this language for it, was what his nervous system had finally organized itself enough to communicate to him. He was living a life that had never actually felt like his life. For decades, he had been pushing himself to accomplish things that looked good from the outside, the career, the success, the stability, without ever checking in with whether these were actually the things he wanted to be doing. He had internalized the values of his culture, his family, his peers, and then organized his entire adult existence around achieving markers of success that he had never actually chosen. And at 47, his system was finally tired enough, burnt out enough, depleted enough to refuse to cooperate anymore. The deeper truth, the one that Michael would only understand months later, was that his motivation hadn't disappeared because something was wrong with him. His motivation had disappeared because his nervous system had finally reached a threshold where it could no longer pretend that the current structure of his life was sustainable or worth sustaining. Motivation requires a kind of forward momentum, a sense that you're building towards something, that your effort matters. Michael's nervous system had figured out that he was just maintaining, not building. He was sustaining something that didn't belong to him, performing a role that had fit once, but no longer did. And the only way his system knew how to communicate that was to shut down the entire motivational apparatus and force him to pay attention to what he was actually experiencing rather than what he was supposed to be experiencing. Chapter 5. The breaking point. For months, Michael managed to hold the structure together even though the inside had begun to collapse. He was good at compartmentalization. It was one of the skills that had made him successful in his career. You separated your personal feelings from your professional obligations. You showed up. You delivered. You didn't let your internal state determine whether the work got done. So he continued to go to work. He continued to attend meetings. He continued to make decisions that affected other people's jobs and projects and trajectories. From the outside, nothing had changed. His performance reviews didn't slip. His boss didn't notice anything amiss. The people who worked for him didn't sense that their director had essentially checked out. But the effort required to maintain that facade was becoming unsustainable. Every morning felt like preparing for a performance that he had no interest in giving. He would wake up and immediately feel the weight of the day ahead. Not excitement about what needed to be accomplished, but a kind of dread at the prospect of having to pretend to care about things he didn't actually care about anymore. His body was becoming more honest than his mind. He would get tension headaches that would start mid-morning and persist until he left the office. His jaw would clench so tightly during meetings that his teeth would ache by evening. He started experiencing acid reflux, the kind where you wake up at 2 a.m. with that burning sensation in your chest and can't fall back asleep because your body is in a state of activation that your conscious mind can't explain. Sarah noticed something was wrong, though Michael did his best to convince her and himself that everything was fine. She would ask him if he was okay, and he would say that he was just tired, just stressed, just dealing with work stuff. Which was true in a technical sense, but it wasn't the actual truth. The actual truth was that he had stopped being able to imagine a future where anything changed or improved. The actual truth was that he was beginning to question whether there was any point to continuing to maintain the structure of his life, if it never felt like anything other than maintenance. The actual truth was that he was having thoughts, quiet and persistent, about whether it would be better if he just didn't exist, though he wasn't actively suicidal. It was more like a persistent background wish that he could somehow opt out without having to go through the drama of actually doing something about it. In April of that year, Michael attended his company's annual strategy retreat, 3 days at a hotel up in Sonoma, where the leadership team was supposed to get away from the daily grind and think about the big picture, the vision, the future direction of the company. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being paid to help strategize the future of an organization, while he couldn't imagine having a future that felt worth living. He sat through presentations about market expansion and product roadmaps and talent development. He participated in team-building exercises designed to create psychological safety and vulnerability. And on the second night, at dinner, something shifted. The CEO was giving a speech about the company's values and the importance of each person on the team living those values both in and out of work. One of those values was ownership, the idea that everyone should take full responsibility for their work, their results, their contributions. The CEO was talking about how this value had made all the difference in the company's success, how it attracted the kind of people who wanted to be accountable, who didn't want to make excuses or blame external circumstances. And as Michael sat there listening, something inside him broke open. Not in a dramatic way. There was no moment where he stood up and made a speech or walked out, but internally, something gave way. He had spent nearly 2 decades taking ownership of his life, his career, his responsibilities, his outcomes. He had internalized the message that if something wasn't working, it was because he hadn't tried hard enough, or wanted it enough, or deployed enough discipline and effort. And in that moment, sitting at a table full of successful people who all believed the same thing, he understood with perfect clarity that he couldn't do it anymore. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in his hotel room, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to actually think about what was true. The truth was that he didn't want to work at this company anymore, probably not in this industry. The truth was that he couldn't keep living the life he was living, not because of external circumstances, but because his entire being had rejected it. The truth was that he had organized his entire adult existence around achieving things that other people valued. And he had organized it so successfully that he had no actual sense of what he wanted or who he was underneath all the achievement. The truth was that somewhere along the way, the formula had stopped working, but he had kept pushing anyway, because that was what you were supposed to do. And then came the thought that changed everything. What if this wasn't a failure to fix himself? What if this was actually information? What if his motivation hadn't disappeared because something was wrong with him? What if it had disappeared because something had become true that his entire system was trying to communicate to him? What if his nervous system had finally reached a point where it couldn't maintain the fiction anymore? Where the gap between what he was supposed to want and what was actually true about him had become so large that the whole structure had to collapse. Michael spent the rest of that night cycling between panic and a strange kind of clarity. He wasn't having a breakdown, or rather, he was having a breakdown. But it felt more like a breakthrough, like the structure that had been containing him was finally falling away. By the time dawn came, he knew that something fundamental had shifted. He couldn't go back to pretending that his life was working. He couldn't go back to trying to motivate himself to care about things he didn't care about. He couldn't go back to the formula that had gotten him here, because the formula had led him to a place where he couldn't feel anything at all. When he got back to the office on Monday, Michael asked for a meeting with his boss. He told her that he needed to take some time off. Not a vacation, but actual time. He was vague about the details, just said that he needed to step back and figure some things out. He didn't mention that he was falling apart. He didn't mention that he had stopped believing in the entire structure of his career or his life. He just said he needed time, and somewhat to his surprise, his boss agreed. She seemed to understand in a way that suggested maybe other people had needed this too, even if they hadn't been willing to name it out loud. What Michael was about to discover, as he finally stopped trying to fix himself through force of will and started actually paying attention to what was true, was that the breaking point wasn't the end of anything. It was actually the beginning of the only path that could have led him anywhere real. By finally allowing himself to acknowledge that the structure couldn't hold anymore, by giving up the pretense that he just needed to try harder or want it more. He was actually about to learn what came next. What happens when you stop relying on motivation and start relying on something else entirely? Chapter 6. First Steps. When Michael took time off from work, he initially thought he would use it to rest and recover and then figure out his next move. As if there was some standard protocol for this kind of situation, some proven methodology for getting yourself unbroken. He had 2 weeks officially, though his boss had been vague about whether he could extend it if he needed to. His first instinct was to fill that time productively. He thought about taking a course on something new, maybe doing some consulting work on the side, maybe volunteering somewhere to feel like he was doing something meaningful. He had spent so much of his life organizing time that the idea of simply having empty time felt almost obscene. But something in him resisted the impulse to structure those 2 weeks into another achievement project. He was tired of achievement projects. He was tired of organizing his life around productivity and outcomes, and whether he was doing things right. So instead, on the first Monday of his time off, he did something he hadn't done in years. He did nothing. He didn't go to the gym. He didn't check his email. He didn't read articles about the tech industry or listen to podcasts about leadership or self-improvement. He sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, and he watched the trees move in the wind. And for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was failing at something. That day was disorienting. His mind kept trying to generate something he should be doing, some productive use of the time. The discomfort of just sitting with himself was almost physical. But he pushed through it. And by the afternoon, something unexpected happened. He started to notice things. The quality of the light at different times of day, the sound of birds, the way his breathing changed when he wasn't thinking about work. Small things that had been there the entire time. but that he had been too busy to notice, or more accurately, too defended against himself to actually perceive. That evening, Sarah asked him if he was okay. And for the first time in a very long time, he actually tried to tell her the truth. Not the whole truth, that was too much to attempt in one conversation, but a version of it. He told her that he had been feeling disconnected from work, from their life, from himself. He told her that something inside him had stopped working, and he didn't know how to fix it. He told her that he didn't know what he wanted anymore. Sarah listened, and then she said something that would stay with him. Maybe that's actually good. Maybe you needed to stop knowing for a while. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer solutions. She just sat with him in the discomfort of not knowing. Over the next few days, Michael started to notice patterns in how his body felt and what he was drawn toward. When he sat quietly, the anxiety that had been constantly humming in his nervous system began to ease. When he tried to be productive or organize the time, it came rushing back. When he forced himself to exercise or eat perfectly or follow some protocol for self-improvement, he felt worse. But when he simply allowed himself to rest and move slowly and pay attention to what felt true in his body, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight loosening, a small opening. But it was there. One afternoon, Michael went for a walk without any particular destination in mind. He wasn't exercising. He wasn't tracking his steps or calculating calories or checking his heart rate. He was just walking through the neighborhood where he had lived for 15 years. And he realized that he had never actually been present in this neighborhood. He had driven through it thousands of times on the way to somewhere else. He had maintained the house and the yard as part of the maintenance of his life. But he had never actually experienced living here. He noticed a coffee shop that he had apparently walked past hundreds of times, but had never entered. He went in and sat for 2 hours with a book and an espresso, and absolutely no agenda. This was the beginning of Michael's education in how to live in a way that wasn't organized around outcome and achievement. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden insights or complete transformations. But slowly, as he stopped trying to force himself into the shape of who he thought he should be, he started to notice what actually interested him. He noticed that he enjoyed conversations that went somewhere unpredictable. He noticed that he liked working with his hands. He had bought some materials and started rebuilding a cabinet in the kitchen, something he would normally have hired someone to do because it seemed like an inefficient use of his time. He noticed that he felt more alive when he was with Sarah without the constant background awareness that he should be somewhere else doing something more important. The crucial thing that was happening, though Michael couldn't have articulated it at the time, was that he was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his own nervous system. For decades, he had been operating in a mode where his body was just a vehicle for his ambitions, something to be optimized and maintained and occasionally ignored if it was inconvenient. But his body had information. His body had been trying to tell him something for a long time, and the message had gotten increasingly urgent until it finally manifested as complete emotional flatness and the shutdown of all motivation. Now, by simply paying attention to what his body was telling him, what made it relax, what made it tense, what felt like truth and what felt like performance, he was starting to get in conversation with himself again. Around this time, Michael started reading about neuroscience and psychology. Not in his typical high-efficiency way, where he was trying to extract information as quickly as possible, but slowly, thinking about the implications. He learned that what he had been experiencing wasn't a personal failure or a character flaw. It was what happens when a nervous system finally reaches a threshold where it can no longer sustain the patterns it has been running. He learned about the vagus nerve and the polyvagal theory, and how your nervous system has different states: fight or flight, rest and digest, and a kind of freeze state that happens when you're caught between impossible options. He realized that for years, maybe decades, he had been operating in a kind of chronic activation state, a subtle fight or flight that he had learned to call normal because it was just how successful people operated. What was beginning to happen was that Michael was starting to understand motivation not as something he needed to generate through willpower, but as something that emerged naturally when his nervous system wasn't in a defensive state. When he was rested and present, not trying to prove something, things interested him. He found himself curious about people and conversations. He found himself wanting to understand how things worked. He found himself drawn toward activities that had nothing to do with achievement or efficiency. He wasn't yet ready to make any major life changes. He wasn't ready to quit his job or completely restructure his life. But he was beginning to understand that the problem wasn't that he was broken. The problem was that the structure of his life had been built on a foundation that wasn't aligned with what was actually true about how his nervous system needed to operate. Chapter 7. A New Way to Move Forward. By the end of his second week off, Michael was beginning to understand something fundamental about how he had been operating, and it was shifting his entire understanding of what motivation actually is and what happens when it stops working. He was sitting with a therapist for the first time, not because he had decided he needed therapy in the traditional sense, but because he was genuinely curious about his own psychology and wanted to talk to someone who could help him understand the patterns he was seeing. The therapist asked him a question that seemed simple at first, but that opened up an entirely new way of thinking. When you're doing something that feels alive to you, what's different about that compared to when you're doing something that feels like obligation? Michael thought about it. His first instinct was to say that when something felt alive, he wanted to do it more, which would have been circular, just restating the problem. But as he sat with the question, he realized something different. When he was doing something that felt genuinely alive, he wasn't thinking about whether it was productive or efficient, or whether it would lead somewhere important. He was just interested in it. His attention was there. His body was engaged rather than defended. There was no voice in his head evaluating whether this was the right use of his time, or whether he should be doing something else instead. He was just present in the activity itself, not split between the activity and some imagined future outcome. That was the opposite of how he had lived for decades. His entire life had been organized around managing his attention away from the present moment and toward some future outcome. When he was at work, he wasn't really at work. He was at work thinking about how this project would position him for the next promotion. When he was with his family, he wasn't really with his family. Part of his attention was always elsewhere, thinking about whether he was doing it right or whether this was an efficient use of the time. He had become so expert at managing his attention toward outcomes that he had almost completely lost the capacity to be present in anything. Michael started experimenting with this insight. He noticed that when he made decisions based on what genuinely interested him in the moment, rather than what he thought he should be interested in, everything shifted. One day Sarah mentioned that she had always wanted to learn to cook something more adventurous than their usual rotation. And instead of filing that away as a nice idea that he didn't have time for, he said yes. They spent an afternoon making pasta from scratch. Actually making it, not using a machine, just hands and flour and eggs. And for the first time in years, Michael lost track of time in a way that didn't involve exhaustion or dissociation. He was actually there. His attention was present. And what surprised him was that it felt energizing rather than depleting, even though he was working the entire time. Around this same period, Michael started reading about neuroscience in a way that felt less like consuming information and more like actually understanding his own experience. He came across research on the polyvagal theory, work developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, that fundamentally changed how scientists understand the nervous system. What Porges discovered challenged the traditional understanding that the nervous system had two states: fight or flight when stressed, and rest and digest when safe. The research showed that the nervous system actually has three distinct operational states, and understanding these states became crucial for Michael to make sense of what had been happening to him. The first state is what researchers call the ventral vagal state, the state where your nervous system feels genuinely safe. When you're in this state, your body is in parasympathetic activation, which means your heart rate is regulated, your digestion is working properly, you're capable of social connection and rational thought, and your immune system is functioning optimally. This is the state where real engagement happens, where you can be present and interested and creative. This is the state where you're not defending yourself, so your full intelligence is available. Michael recognized this state. It was what he felt like when he was making pasta with Sarah, or sitting quietly on the porch, or having a real conversation where he was actually listening instead of preparing his response. The second state is the sympathetic activation state, the fight or flight response. When there's a genuine threat, your nervous system activates this state. Your heart rate increases, your muscles prepare for action, your thinking becomes more focused and reactive. This state is designed to be temporary. It's meant to activate when there's actual danger and then resolve once the threat passes. The problem for people like Michael was that they had spent decades in a chronic version of this state without recognizing it. The threat wasn't physical. It was the constant pressure to perform, to achieve, to prove himself, to maintain the image of someone who had everything under control. His nervous system had learned to interpret the demands of his career and his life as ongoing threats that required constant defensive activation. But there's a third state that Porges identified, one that's often invisible and deeply misunderstood. It's called the dorsal vagal state, sometimes referred to as the freeze response or shutdown state. When your nervous system encounters a situation where you're caught between impossible options, where you can't fight your way out and you can't run away, it shifts into this state. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism. If you're a small animal caught by a predator and you can't escape, playing dead sometimes keeps you alive. Your system shuts down, your metabolism slows, you become numb, you disconnect from feeling. This is what had been happening to Michael. He had been trapped between two impossible options. He couldn't fight against the structure of his life because it provided financial security and met external expectations, and he couldn't run away from it without consequences that felt unbearable. So his nervous system had done what nervous systems do when caught in that bind. It had activated the freeze response. It had shut down. This was the moment everything clicked into place for Michael. His motivation hadn't disappeared because something was wrong with him. His motivation had disappeared because his nervous system, operating under the polyvagal framework that Porges describes, had reached a threshold where it could no longer maintain the chronic sympathetic activation that his life required. The freeze response wasn't a failure. It was actually intelligent communication from his body. His system was saying, "This structure cannot continue. The gap between what your life looks like and what feels true for you is too large. I'm shutting down the forward momentum because pushing forward in this direction will cause damage." Understanding this framework changed Michael's entire relationship with what had been happening to him. According to research in vagal tone, the flexibility of your nervous system to move between these different states. Chronically stressed people often have reduced vagal tone, meaning their nervous system gets stuck in either the sympathetic activation or the dorsal shutdown state, and has difficulty returning to the ventral vagal state where genuine engagement is possible. Michael's system had been stuck in sympathetic activation for so long that it had finally crashed into dorsal shutdown just to protect him. The solution wasn't to force himself back into sympathetic activation through willpower or motivation. The solution was to rebuild his capacity to return to the ventral vagal state, the state of genuine safety where real engagement could happen naturally. This led him to an understanding that contradicted everything he had believed about motivation and discipline. Real engagement, what Portes and other researchers call social engagement in the context of the polyvagal theory, isn't something you generate through willpower. It emerges naturally when your nervous system perceives safety. When you're not in a defensive state, your full intelligence is available. You're capable of genuine curiosity and presence. You can be interested in things without evaluating whether they're productive or efficient. Your body stops running the constant background calculation of threat and performance. This also explained why the conventional motivational strategies had stopped working for Michael. Those strategies all relied on maintaining sympathetic activation, pushing harder, wanting it more intensely, generating more discipline. But his nervous system couldn't sustain that activation anymore. What he needed instead was to rebuild safety in his life, both literally through changing his circumstances and metaphorically through learning to trust his own perceptions of what felt true. Research on nervous system regulation shows that safety is primarily established through social connection and through activities that signal to your body that the environment is predictable and that you don't need to be constantly on guard. Michael's life had become predictable in structure, but deeply unpredictable in meaning. He was doing the same things every day, but nothing felt true. His nervous system couldn't register safety under those conditions, no matter how secure the circumstances appeared from the outside. The crucial thing that had shifted was that Michael was no longer expecting motivation to be the fuel for his life. He was no longer waiting for some internal transformation that would make him want the things he thought he should want. Instead, he was learning to reorganize his life in a way that allowed his nervous system to return to the ventral vagal state, the state of genuine safety and engagement. From that place, according to the polyvagal framework, actions and decisions emerged naturally. Not because he was forcing them through willpower, not because he was motivated, but because they were aligned with what his nervous system could perceive as genuinely safe and true. When he went back to work after his leave, Michael carried this understanding with him. He was still the same person with the same job, but his orientation had fundamentally changed. He was no longer trying to maintain constant sympathetic activation through motivation and discipline. Instead, he was paying attention to whether his nervous system perceived safety in different situations, and he was making decisions based on that information. His presence at work shifted because he was no longer split between the moment and some imagined future outcome. He was actually there. And from that place of presence, that ventral vagal engagement, he began to understand what real change actually required. Not motivation, not willpower, but the rebuilding of a nervous system that had learned to trust that it could be safe while being authentically itself. Chapter 8. First Practices. Rebuilding Nervous System Safety. Now that you understand how your nervous system operates, how it can get stuck in sympathetic activation or dorsal shutdown, the question becomes practical. What do you actually do about it? This is where theory has to meet lived experience, where understanding the polyvagal framework becomes something more than intellectual knowledge and becomes something you can apply to your actual life starting today. The goal isn't to fix yourself or achieve some optimized state. The goal is simply to give your nervous system the information it needs to recognize that it's actually safe, and from that place of safety, to allow genuine engagement and presence to emerge naturally. The first practice is deceptively simple, which is partly why most people skip over it. It's called grounding, and what it means is creating moments where your nervous system gets clear, unmistakable signals that you're present in your body and present in the current moment. According to research on somatic practices and nervous system regulation, your body doesn't distinguish between an actual threat and a perceived threat. It responds the same way. But it also doesn't distinguish between genuine safety cues and perceived safety cues. If you give your nervous system clear signals that you're safe, it will begin to believe it. The simplest form of grounding is this. Find a place where you can sit or stand for 5 minutes without being interrupted. Notice what your feet are touching, whether that's the ground, a floor, a carpet. Really notice it. Feel the texture. Feel the weight of your body being supported. This is called earthing or grounding. And the research on it shows that the simple act of your physical body making contact with the earth or a solid surface sends a signal to your nervous system that you're physically supported. Your nervous system responds to that signal. After a few minutes of this kind of attention, most people notice that their breathing has deepened, their jaw has unclenched, their shoulders have dropped. These are signs that your nervous system is beginning to move out of that defensive activation state and back toward the ventral vagal state, where real engagement is possible. Michael started doing this in the morning before anything else. He would sit on his back porch with his feet on the ground, and he would spend 5 minutes just noticing the physical sensations. The cool grass under his feet, the temperature of the air, the sound of birds. Nothing dramatic. No meditation or mindfulness instructions. Just genuine attention to physical sensation. What he noticed was that those 5 minutes changed his entire day. He wasn't in a state of constant low-level anxiety anymore. He could think more clearly. His interactions with Sarah felt more genuine because he was actually present instead of partially defended. The second practice involves what researchers call vagal toning, essentially strengthening your nervous system's ability to shift between states. One of the most powerful vagal toning exercises is something called the vagal break, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges. What it involves is deliberately activating your parasympathetic nervous system through specific physical practices. The most accessible version is something called humming or singing. When you hum, you're vibrating the vagus nerve, which runs from your brain through your throat and down through your heart and digestive system. According to research on vocal vibration and nervous system regulation, humming activates your parasympathetic nervous system in a way that's almost immediate. This sounds almost absurdly simple, but research from institutions like the Polyvagal Institute shows that the practice is genuinely effective. You don't need to sing well or be musical. You just hum. Even 5 minutes of humming changes your nervous system state. Michael started humming in the shower in the morning, something he had never done before. At first, it felt weird. His default state had been so defended that making any kind of spontaneous sound felt vulnerable. But as he continued, he noticed that the humming shifted something in him. His breath would deepen, his jaw would release, and then he would notice that his thinking shifted too. Problems that had seemed intractable the night before seemed more manageable. Not because anything had changed externally, but because his nervous system had shifted out of the fight or flight state and into a state where his full intelligence was available. The third practice is about what researchers call co-regulation, essentially borrowing someone else's nervous system state to help regulate your own. This is why being with people who feel safe and present can be so healing. Your nervous system actually mirrors the nervous system state of people around you. According to polyvagal research on social engagement systems, when you're in the presence of someone whose nervous system is regulated and calm, your own nervous system begins to regulate. Michael started doing this intentionally with Sarah. Instead of trying to have productive conversations or solve problems together, he started simply being present with her without agenda. He would sit next to her while she read. He would listen to her talk without trying to fix anything or offer solutions. What he discovered was that her regulated nervous system helped regulate his. It wasn't magic. It was neurobiology. His system was learning that it was actually safe to relax, that there wasn't a constant threat requiring his vigilance. The fourth practice involves what's called interoception, essentially learning to notice and trust the signals your body is sending you. Most people in their middle years have spent so long operating in a defended state that they've lost the ability to actually hear what their body is telling them. They're used to pushing through physical signals that something isn't working. They're used to ignoring exhaustion, ignoring tension, ignoring the quiet voice inside saying, "This doesn't feel right." The practice here is simple. Several times a day, pause and ask your body a genuine question. Not, "Should I do this?" but, "What does my body actually need right now?" And then listen, really listen. Not with the part of your mind that's evaluating whether the answer is productive or efficient, but with the part that's actually present in your body. Michael started doing this at work. Before meetings, he would take 30 seconds and check in with himself. What do I actually need right now? Sometimes the answer was, I need to move my body. Sometimes it was, I need to drink water. Sometimes it was, I don't actually need to be in this meeting. The remarkable thing was that when he followed what his body was telling him, when he honored that information instead of overriding it, his presence at work actually improved. He was less scattered because he wasn't fighting himself. His thinking was clearer because his nervous system wasn't in a state of constant resistance. The fifth practice is about what researchers call pendulation, the practice of deliberately noticing when your nervous system shifts between states and learning to ride that movement. According to somatic therapy research, your nervous system is never completely stuck in one state. There are moments throughout the day when it shifts. The practice is to notice those moments. You'll be tense, then something happens, and you notice a moment of ease. Your job is simply to notice it, to give your nervous system the feedback that yes, safety is possible. Michael started noticing these moments and literally naming them to himself. There's that ease again. That's what ventral vagal feels like. By noticing and naming these moments, he was essentially training his nervous system to recognize safety more quickly and to stay there longer. The crucial thing about all of these practices is that they're not about trying to be better or achieve some state of perfect regulation. They're about giving your nervous system increasingly clear, consistent signals that it's actually safe. That safety isn't something you have to earn or achieve. It's something that emerges naturally when your nervous system gets enough evidence that the environment and the people around you are trustworthy. When that begins to happen, something shifts. You don't need motivation anymore because you're not defending against your own life. You don't need willpower to push yourself forward because you're actually interested in what's happening. Your nervous system is in the ventral vagal state where genuine engagement is possible. One more critical point before you move forward. All of these practices work better when they're done with a genuine spirit of curiosity rather than another form of self-improvement. Michael's mistake at first was trying to do these practices perfectly, trying to measure whether they were working, trying to optimize them. When he let go of that and just started practicing them because they felt true, because his body wanted to hum, wanted to feel grounded, wanted to be present, that's when they actually started to work. Your nervous system can tell the difference between genuine curiosity about your own experience and another form of trying to fix yourself. It responds to the real thing. The path forward isn't complicated. It's not a 12-step program or a 6-month protocol or a system you have to master. It's simply a consistent return to practices that signal to your nervous system that it's safe to be present, safe to be engaged, safe to be authentically yourself. From that place of safety, motivation becomes irrelevant. Not because you don't care anymore, but because you're no longer operating in a system that requires external motivation to function. You're operating from genuine presence and genuine interest, which is infinitely more powerful and infinitely more sustainable than any motivation you could possibly generate. Chapter 9. Myth number 4. You need a perfect system. There's a particular flavor of paralysis that comes from believing that the solution to your life requires finding the right system. You've probably experienced this yourself. The moment where you realize that things aren't working, and your immediate next thought is that you need to find the correct framework, the right methodology, the perfect structure that will finally make everything click into place. This belief is so pervasive in contemporary culture that it almost feels like common sense. We're surrounded by systems, productivity systems, health systems, financial systems, relationship systems. There's an app for everything. There's a protocol for everything. The underlying assumption is that if you just find the right system and follow it correctly, you'll get the results you want. For people in their middle years, this myth is particularly insidious because by this point in life, you've probably tried multiple systems. You've tried the productivity systems that promise to revolutionize your time management. You've tried the health systems that guaranteed you'd finally lose weight or get in shape. You've tried the relationship systems that were supposed to deepen your marriage or improve your parenting. Some of them worked for a while. Some of them didn't work at all. And what you've likely concluded is not that systems themselves are the problem, but that you haven't found the right system yet, the one that will finally be the answer. So you keep searching. The myth persists because it contains an appealing logic. If the problem is external, if it's about finding the right structure, then the solution is also external. You don't have to change yourself. You don't have to question your fundamental assumptions about how life should work. You just need to find the right system and implement it. This is incredibly appealing because it means you can solve the problem through effort and willpower, which are things you believe you have access to. You can work harder at finding the system, and then you can work harder at implementing it. The problem becomes a technical problem rather than an existential one. Here's what the myth misses. Systems are only as good as the person implementing them, and the person implementing them is operating within a particular nervous system state. When your nervous system is in sympathetic activation, that fight or flight state that most high-achieving people in their middle years are operating in, no system will work sustainably. You might implement the system perfectly for 2 or 3 weeks. You might see results. But eventually, you'll crash because your nervous system can't sustain that level of effort and attention indefinitely. The system didn't fail. Your nervous system did what nervous systems do when pushed beyond their capacity. It activated the brake and shut things down. Michael experienced this cycle multiple times before he understood what was really happening. He tried a productivity system based on time blocking, dividing his day into specific chunks dedicated to specific tasks. For the first month, it was remarkable. His output increased. He felt more organized. And then his nervous system rebelled. He found himself unable to follow the system because his body was exhausted. Not by the system itself, but by the constant mental effort required to maintain it while simultaneously managing all the other demands on his attention. He tried a health system based on intermittent fasting and high-intensity exercise. Again, initial results. Again, sustainable failure as his depleted nervous system began to struggle with the additional demands. The deeper issue here is something that researchers in behavioral change call the implementation gap. The space between knowing what you're supposed to do and actually being able to do it consistently. Most people assume this gap is a personal failure. They think it means they lack discipline or commitment or willpower. But according to research on habit formation and behavioral psychology, the implementation gap usually indicates a mismatch between the system and the person's current capacity. If you're already at your capacity, if your nervous system is already maxed out, adding another system on top of that won't work. No matter how good the system is or how much willpower you deploy. What makes this even more complicated is that the search for the perfect system often becomes a form of avoidance. You're searching for the system instead of actually addressing the deeper question, what is it about my life that requires a system in the first place? Why do I need an external structure to do things that should theoretically be natural and engaging? If you genuinely want to spend time with your family, why do you need a relationship system? If you're genuinely interested in your health, why do you need a detailed fitness protocol? The fact that these things require elaborate systems often indicates that something is fundamentally misaligned, that you're trying to force yourself to care about things that don't actually align with what's true for you. Michael realized this when he started asking himself a different question. Instead of, what system do I need? He started asking, what would need to be true about my life for the things I care about to happen naturally, without requiring an external system? It was a much scarier question, because the answer often involved things that couldn't be solved through implementation and effort. The answer often involved fundamental changes to how he was organizing his life, which required facing things he didn't want to face. The possibility that his career wasn't actually what he wanted. The possibility that his relationship needed something deeper than a system. The possibility that his health issues were connected to his nervous system state rather than a lack of willpower. According to research on goal setting and behavioral change, particularly work by researchers like B.J. Fogg at Stanford, the most sustainable behavior change happens not through implementing complex systems, but through making tiny changes that fit into existing patterns and that feel intrinsically rewarding. You don't need a system for something that's genuinely interesting to you. You need a system precisely when something doesn't feel intrinsically rewarding, and you need an external structure to force yourself to do it. The question, then, is whether forcing yourself to do things that don't feel intrinsically rewarding is actually a viable long-term strategy. For people in their middle years, the answer is usually no. This doesn't mean that structure and systems are entirely useless. What it means is that structure and systems are most effective when they're supporting something that's already intrinsically interesting or important to you, rather than trying to create that interest through force. Michael eventually did create some structures in his life, but they looked very different from the systems he had tried before. Instead of a rigid productivity system, he created a basic rhythm to his day that worked with his nervous system rather than against it. Mornings for things that required his sharpest thinking. Afternoons for collaborative work where social engagement was possible. Evenings for activities that felt regenerative. This wasn't complicated. It wasn't optimized. It was just a recognition of how his nervous system actually functioned and an organization of his time that worked with that rather than fighting it. The paradox is that when you stop looking for the perfect system and start paying attention to what your nervous system is actually telling you, Your life often becomes more organized and more effective than it was when you were trying to implement complex systems. Not because the absence of systems is somehow magical, but because you're no longer wasting energy fighting yourself. You're working with yourself instead of against yourself. Your nervous system is in the ventral vagal state where genuine intelligence and presence are possible. Which means you naturally make better decisions and naturally follow through with more consistency because the things you're doing feel aligned rather than forced. The version of this myth that's particularly damaging for people in their 40s and 50s is the belief that if you just find the right life system, the right work situation, the right relationship configuration, the right living arrangement, everything will finally work. You'll finally feel happy. You'll finally feel satisfied. You'll finally feel like your life makes sense. But this is still operating under the false assumption that the problem is external, that you need to find the right external structure. In reality, what you need is to rebuild your relationship with yourself, your nervous system, your body, your authentic desires, so that whatever structure you create is actually aligned with what's true for you, rather than constantly fighting against it. Chapter 10. Myth Ver 5. Laziness is a character problem. The word laziness has become one of the most damaging concepts in how people in their middle years understand themselves. When you're not motivated, when you don't have the energy to push yourself forward, when you find yourself avoiding things that you know you should be doing, the immediate interpretation is that you're lazy. And laziness, according to the cultural narrative that most of us have internalized, is a character flaw. It's weakness. It's the absence of discipline. It's a personal failing that reflects something broken about your fundamental nature. This belief is so deeply embedded that even when you intellectually understand that you're exhausted or depleted or operating in a state of nervous system dysregulation, there's still a voice inside that's telling you that the real problem is that you just don't care enough, that you're not trying hard enough, that if you were a better person, you would push through the fatigue. What this framework misses is that what we call laziness is almost never actually laziness. Laziness would be a preference for inactivity when you have access to genuine rest and restoration. But most of the time, what people call laziness is actually one of three things. It's burnout, it's misalignment, or it's your nervous system communicating that something needs to change. Burnout is what happens when you've been in a state of chronic sympathetic activation for too long. Your system doesn't have reserves left. When you don't have reserves, the smallest tasks feel enormously difficult. Getting out of bed feels like pushing a boulder uphill. Checking your email feels impossible. Not because you're weak, but because your system is genuinely depleted. Misalignment is different. Misalignment happens when you're trying to force yourself to do things that don't actually align with what matters to you. You might be very good at these things. You might even get recognition for them. But because they're not genuinely aligned with your values or your interests, they require constant willpower to maintain. And willpower, as we've established, is a finite resource. When you're trying to maintain misalignment through willpower, the moment your willpower reserves get low, you'll appear lazy. You'll avoid the tasks. You'll procrastinate. You'll feel guilty about not doing them. But the real issue isn't that you're lazy. The real issue is that you're trying to make yourself want something that you don't actually want. And that's an exhausting, unsustainable project. The third thing that gets labeled as laziness is actually your nervous system communicating through the language of avoidance. When your nervous system perceives that continuing on the current trajectory is unsustainable or unsafe, it will create resistance. You'll feel like you don't want to do things. You'll procrastinate. you'll find reasons why today isn't the right day. This isn't a character flaw. This is your nervous system trying to protect you. It's saying, this current pattern is not working. We need to change something. And the way it communicates that is through making the continuation of that pattern feel impossible, which gets interpreted as laziness. Michael experienced all three of these at different points. In the months leading up to his breaking point, what he had interpreted as his own laziness and lack of discipline was actually acute burnout. His system didn't have reserves left. The smallest tasks required enormous effort. He would set goals to exercise or work on a personal project. And then, when he couldn't follow through, he would interpret that as a personal failure. Evidence that he didn't care enough, that he wasn't disciplined enough. What was actually happening was that he was running on empty, and his nervous system was desperately trying to communicate that to him through the language of complete exhaustion. According to research on burnout and nervous system depletion, when you're in a state of genuine burnout, your capacity for willpower becomes almost zero. Your brain is using enormous amounts of resources just to maintain basic functioning. There's nothing left over for motivation or discipline or pushing yourself forward. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, who has studied trauma and nervous system regulation, have shown that burnout looks very similar to trauma responses in the brain. There's a similar depletion of resources, a similar inability to access your full cognitive and emotional capacity. Telling someone in a state of burnout to just push harder or care more is like telling someone who's bleeding to just will their blood to stay inside their body. It's addressing the wrong level of the problem. This is where understanding the polyvagal framework becomes crucial. Remember that your nervous system has three states: ventral vagal engagement, sympathetic activation, and dorsal vagal shutdown. What gets called laziness is often just dorsal vagal shutdown. Your nervous system has determined that continued effort in the current direction is unsustainable and has activated the brake. From the perspective of your conscious mind, it looks like you've stopped caring, stopped trying, become lazy. From the perspective of your nervous system, it's the most intelligent response available. It's the system protecting itself from collapse by forcing a cessation of the current pattern. The damage of the laziness myth is that it causes people to resist and fight against their own nervous system's attempts to protect them. Instead of listening to the signal that something needs to change, you interpret it as a character flaw and try to override it through willpower. You push harder. You try to care more. You judge yourself for not being able to maintain the current trajectory. And this creates a vicious cycle. Your nervous system is sending increasingly urgent signals that change is needed, and you're responding by trying harder to maintain the status quo. Eventually, something has to give. For people in their middle years, this becomes even more complicated because by this point in life, you've probably had a lot of evidence that you can be disciplined. You've succeeded at difficult things. You've pushed yourself and accomplished goals. So when you find yourself unable to push anymore, the interpretation often is that something has fundamentally broken in you, that you've lost the capacity that you had before. This isn't usually true. What's usually true is that the price of maintaining the current structure has become higher than your system is willing or able to pay. The laziness isn't new. What's new is that your system has finally reached a threshold where it's going to force a confrontation with what's unsustainable about the current structure. Michael's moment of apparent laziness, when he couldn't seem to motivate himself to do anything, when even the smallest tasks felt impossible, wasn't actually laziness. It was his nervous system finally communicating loudly enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. And what changed wasn't that he found more discipline or more willpower or finally cared enough. What changed was that he started listening to what his system was telling him instead of fighting it. He stopped interpreting the signal as a character flaw and started interpreting it as information. And from that place of listening, actual change became possible. This is the crucial distinction. The moment you stop fighting your own nervous system's attempts to communicate and start listening to what it's trying to tell you, everything shifts. You don't suddenly become more disciplined. You don't suddenly care more. But you do stop expending enormous amounts of energy fighting yourself. And that energy, which was being used for internal resistance, becomes available for something else. It becomes available for actually responding to what your system is telling you. It becomes available for making changes that align with what's true, rather than trying to force yourself into a shape that never fit in the first place. What people often discover when they stop calling it laziness and start treating it as information is that there was something real that needed attention. Maybe you've been working in the wrong field and your system was telling you that. Maybe you've been in a relationship or living situation that doesn't actually work for you, and your system was telling you that. Maybe you've been organizing your life in a way that's fundamentally unsustainable, and your system was telling you that. The apparent laziness was actually a perfectly calibrated response from your nervous system. It was intelligent. It was protective. It was trying to keep you from destroying yourself through continued adherence to an unsustainable pattern. Chapter 11. Myth number 6. You can't change at this age. This might be the most insidious myth of all, partly because it has just enough truth embedded in it to feel credible. It's true that change becomes more difficult as you get older. It's true that your nervous system has been running certain patterns for decades, and those patterns have become deeply embedded. It's true that you have more constraints at 45 or 50 than you had at 25. Financial obligations, relationship commitments, work situations that you can't simply walk away from. All of that is real. But somewhere between acknowledging those realities and concluding that meaningful change is impossible, most people make a leap that isn't actually supported by evidence. The myth typically sounds like this. You've had 45 or 50 years to become who you are, and that's essentially who you are going to be. You can make surface changes. You can lose weight or get a promotion or improve your marriage slightly. But the fundamental structure of your personality, your capacity, your possibilities is essentially fixed. This belief is reinforced constantly. You see people who've been unhappy in their careers for 20 years, and you assume they're stuck. You see relationships that look stagnant, and you assume that's just how they are. You look at your own life, and you see patterns that have repeated for decades, and you conclude that these patterns are immutable. What this myth is based on is a misunderstanding of how neuroplasticity works. For a long time, neuroscience held that the brain essentially stopped changing after early adulthood. Your neural pathways were set. Your capacities were fixed. You could learn new information, but you couldn't fundamentally rewire how you operated. This understanding has been almost completely overturned by more recent research. According to contemporary neuroscience, your brain maintains the capacity for neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire neural pathways and develop new capacities throughout your entire life. It's true that the process becomes slower as you age. It's true that it requires more repetition and more time than it does in childhood. But the capacity itself doesn't diminish significantly. The research on this is remarkable. Studies have shown that people in their 60s and 70s can learn completely new skills. Languages, musical instruments, complex physical movements, with roughly the same ultimate capacity as younger people, just with a slower learning curve. Studies on meditation and contemplative practice have shown that you can literally change the structure of your brain through repeated practice at any age. Brain imaging studies using fMRI have shown that when people make significant changes in their lives, when they overcome addiction, rebuild relationships, shift careers, the corresponding neural pathways actually rewire. The change isn't just behavioral, it's neurological. But there's something even more important than the capacity for change. And that's understanding what actually drives change in people in their middle years. Michael's transformation didn't happen because he suddenly found willpower or motivation or discovered the right system. His transformation happened because his nervous system reached a threshold where continuing on the current trajectory was no longer possible. And that created a crisis that forced genuine confrontation with what was actually true. This is actually an advantage that people in middle age have compared to younger people. You have enough life experience to see patterns. You have enough evidence to recognize when something isn't working. You have enough accumulated exhaustion to finally be willing to make changes that might feel scary or uncertain. According to research on change and transformation, particularly work by researchers like William Bridges on transition psychology, the most sustainable change happens not through incremental improvement, but through what he calls a transition, a fundamental reorganization of meaning and identity. Young people can make changes through willpower and ambition because they haven't yet built up decades of identity investment in the current structure. But by middle age, you've built a lot of identity around who you are and what you do and how you operate. Genuine change at this stage requires that you're willing to question some of those identity elements. And while that's more difficult than making surface changes, it's also where the most significant and most sustainable transformation becomes possible. Michael's change didn't look like typical self-improvement because he wasn't actually trying to improve himself. He was fundamentally reorganizing his relationship with himself and with his life. He was no longer operating under the assumption that he needed to become a better version of himself. He was operating under the assumption that his current structure had become unsustainable and that something needed to shift. That shift wasn't adding more productivity or more discipline or more optimization. It was a fundamental reorganization of what mattered and how he was going to organize his life around what actually mattered. Here's where the neuroplasticity research becomes really important. Change at this level isn't primarily driven by willpower or motivation. Change at this level is driven by nervous system state. When your nervous system is in the ventral vagal state, when it perceives genuine safety and can access genuine presence, your brain is capable of the kind of integration and reorganization that creates real transformation. According to research by neuroscientist Dan Siegel on integration and brain function, when different parts of your brain are communicating and integrating, when your limbic system and your cortex are working together rather than in opposition, genuine change becomes possible. This integration happens naturally when your nervous system is in a regulated state. What this means practically is that the prerequisite for real change isn't better willpower or more motivation. The prerequisite is nervous system regulation, which is why the practices from Chapter 8, the grounding, the vagal toning, the co-regulation, the interoception, the pendulation, aren't just nice ideas. They're the actual foundation that makes transformation possible. When your nervous system begins to perceive safety, when it moves out of the fight or flight and freeze states and into the ventral vagal state, your entire capacity for change shifts. Your brain can access memories and wisdom and resources that weren't available when it was in a defensive state. Your ability to imagine alternatives becomes possible. Your capacity to tolerate the discomfort of changing familiar patterns increases because your system isn't simultaneously fighting for survival. The other crucial factor in change at this life stage is what researchers call meaning-making. According to research in positive psychology and life meaning, Change that's driven solely by "I should" or "I have to" is rarely sustainable. But change that's driven by meaning, by a genuine sense that something matters and that moving in a particular direction aligns with what you care about, is much more durable. By middle age, you usually have enough life experience to distinguish between the things you think you should care about and the things you actually care about. And when you finally give yourself permission to reorganize your life around what you actually care about rather than what you think you should care about, something shifts. For Michael, the change wasn't complicated on the surface. He didn't undergo some dramatic transformation. He came back to work after his leave. He was more present in meetings. He was more honest about his limits and his capacity. He started paying attention to what actually interested him rather than what he thought should interest him. His marriage became less of a maintenance project and more of an actual relationship because he was present in it rather than half present while thinking about something else. None of these things required him to become a different person. They required him to stop pretending to be someone he wasn't and to reorganize his life around what was actually true about him. And here's the thing that most people don't understand about change at this stage. It often requires less effort than the maintenance of the status quo. Michael had been expending enormous amounts of energy maintaining a life structure that didn't fit him. The appearance of that life, the job, the house, the relationship, the social position, looked solid from the outside. But the internal machinery required to maintain it was running at maximum capacity just to keep it all from falling apart. When he finally allowed the structure to reorganize, when he allowed himself to be more authentic and more aligned, he actually had more energy, not less. Not because he was working harder, but because he wasn't simultaneously fighting himself. The final piece of understanding change at this age is recognizing that you're not trying to become someone new. You're trying to become more authentically yourself. The version of yourself that existed before you started organizing everything around external expectations and external measures of success. And that version of you is still in there. Your capacity for that version of you hasn't diminished with age. It's just been covered over by layers of adaptation and performance and shoulds. When you start removing those layers, when you start paying attention to what's actually true about you beneath all that adaptation, the person who emerges isn't a new person. It's you. Just more real. Just more aligned. Just more capable of genuine engagement and presence, because you're no longer split between who you actually are and who you think you should be. Chapter 12. How Michael Applied Everything. 6 months after Michael took his initial leave from work, his life looked different on the surface, but felt fundamentally different on the inside. He hadn't quit his job dramatically, or made any of the sweeping changes that his initial catastrophic thinking had suggested he would need to make. Instead, he had made a series of smaller decisions that all pointed in the same direction, toward a life that was more aligned with what was actually true about him rather than what he thought should be true. The first thing he did was address his nervous system directly. He committed to the practices from Chapter 8, not as another system to master or optimize, but as simple daily practices that felt true. Every morning, before anything else, he spent 5 minutes grounding with his feet on the ground. He wasn't tracking the time precisely or measuring the results. He was just noticing the physical sensation and letting his nervous system register safety. That 5 minutes changed his entire day. His baseline stress level decreased noticeably. His capacity to be present in conversations increased. His reactivity to small frustrations diminished. He added humming, 15 minutes a day, usually in the shower, but sometimes while walking. It felt absurd at first. He felt self-conscious about making any kind of spontaneous sound. But he pushed through that initial resistance because he could feel the effect on his nervous system. After humming, his mind was clearer. His breathing was deeper. His shoulders were less tense. These weren't dramatic transformations. They were subtle shifts in his nervous system state that accumulated over time. He restructured his work situation, not by leaving, but by being more honest about his actual capacity and his actual priorities. He had a conversation with his boss about the projects he was managing and which ones genuinely mattered versus which ones he had just inherited through inertia. He reduced his workload not through quitting, but through honest communication about what he could sustainably deliver. His boss was actually relieved. She had been worried about his performance and had been considering whether to move him to a different role. When he clearly communicated his limits and his actual interests, a new configuration emerged that worked better for both of them. He invested in his relationship with Sarah differently. Instead of trying to maintain the relationship through effort and obligation, he started being genuinely present with her. They started taking walks without agenda, just walking and talking and being together without the constant background thought about whether this was efficient use of time. He started actually listening to her instead of preparing his responses. These small shifts transformed their relationship in ways that no couples therapy or relationship system ever had. Because the shift was from maintenance mode to genuine presence. At work, his presence shifted too. He was still doing similar work, but his internal relationship with it had changed. He was attending meetings actually present in the meeting rather than half present, while mentally evaluating whether the meeting was a good use of time. He was making decisions based on what actually made sense, rather than on what would look good or position him for advancement. His work became less about performance and more about genuine problem-solving. Interestingly, his reputation improved because people could feel the difference in his presence. He wasn't performing anymore. He was actually there. Perhaps most importantly, Michael started paying attention to what actually interested him. He discovered that he was drawn to understanding how systems worked. Not in the abstract sense of productivity systems, but in the sense of how organizations actually function, what makes people collaborate effectively, what creates healthy team dynamics. This interest had been there for years, but he had dismissed it as impractical. Now he started exploring it. He read books on organizational psychology. He took a course on systems thinking. He started conversations with people at work about these topics. None of this led to a career change or a new job. It just led to a deepening of his engagement with the work he was already doing. What Michael discovered was that the path forward wasn't about finding a new system or making dramatic changes or becoming a different person. It was about systematically removing all the layers of adaptation and performance that had accumulated over decades. As those layers came off, as he stopped pretending to be motivated when he wasn't, stopped trying to want things he didn't want, stopped maintaining a structure that had never actually fit him, something simpler and more real emerged. Not a new Michael, just Michael. More honestly. Michael who could be present. Michael who could make decisions based on what was actually true. Michael who didn't need external motivation because he was aligned with what he was doing. The transformation wasn't magical. There were still frustrations at work. His marriage still required effort and communication. His life still had constraints and obligations. But the quality of his presence in all of those things changed because he was no longer fighting himself. He was no longer split between who he actually was and who he thought he should be. His nervous system had moved out of the defensive states and into a state where genuine engagement was possible. And from that place, change had happened. not because he had deployed more willpower, but because he had finally stopped trying to force himself into a shape that never fit. Chapter 13. How you apply this starting today. Everything you've read up to this point has been building toward this single question. What do you actually do now? Not next month. Not when you figured everything out. Now. Today. Because the truth about applying this material is that understanding it intellectually and applying it practically are two different things. And understanding without application is just another form of avoidance. Another way of telling yourself that you're working on the problem without actually changing anything. So this chapter is about specificity. It's about concrete actions that you can take starting today that will begin to shift your nervous system state and your relationship with yourself and your life. The first thing you need to understand is that this isn't about motivation. You've probably already figured that out by now. But it bears repeating because your brain will try to convince you otherwise. You're going to finish reading this, and something in you will want to feel pumped up and excited and ready to take on the world. And when you don't feel that way, when instead you feel somewhat neutral or uncertain or cautious, your brain will tell you that you're not ready, that you don't want this badly enough, that you should wait until you feel more motivated. Don't believe that voice. That voice is exactly the mechanism that's been keeping you stuck. Applying this material doesn't require motivation. It requires attention and consistency. It requires you to do things even when you don't feel particularly inspired to do them. Not because you're forcing yourself through willpower, but because you're following a signal from your body that these things matter. The entry point is always nervous system regulation. Everything else flows from this. You cannot think your way into real change. You cannot motivate your way into real change. You can only feel your way into it. And feeling is what your nervous system does. So the first week, and I want you to commit to 1 full week before you try to layer anything else onto this. Focus exclusively on the nervous system practices from Chapter 8. Pick one. Don't try to do all 5. Pick the one that feels most accessible to you. If you like physical sensation, start with grounding. If you like sound and movement, start with humming. If you're someone who's socially oriented, start with intentional co-regulation, spending time with someone whose presence feels safe and regulated to you. Do this one practice every single day for 7 days. Not because it's a system you're implementing, not because you're trying to achieve some result, but because your body is asking for a signal that it's safe. That's it. One practice, 7 days. Pay attention to what shifts, not in terms of productivity or mood, but in terms of subtle changes. Do you notice that your breathing is deeper at certain times? Do you notice that your shoulders are less tense? Do you notice that you're sleeping slightly better? Do you notice that conversations feel slightly different? Most people notice something. They also notice that when they stop doing the practice, the baseline stress level begins to creep back up. That's your nervous system speaking. That's information. At the end of 7 days, add a second practice. Not because you're building a system, but because your nervous system is beginning to recognize a pattern. It's learning that you're committed to creating safety. You're not forcing it to stay in a state of activation. You're giving it repeated evidence that you're paying attention to what it needs. This continues for 2 weeks. 2 practices, each done daily, each reinforcing the message that safety is possible and that your nervous system doesn't have to stay in constant activation. During this 2-week period, and this is crucial, do not try to change anything else. Don't try to implement a new productivity system. Don't try to overhaul your diet or your exercise routine or your work situation. Don't try to fix your relationship or make major decisions about your life. You're doing one thing and one thing only. You're beginning to regulate your nervous system. Everything else will emerge from this, but you have to do this first. Most people fail at this point because they try to do too much simultaneously. They think, okay, I'll regulate my nervous system and also start going to the gym and also improve my relationship and also work on my career. Your nervous system doesn't have the resources for that. You'll crash. Do one thing. After 2 weeks, when your nervous system has begun to establish a basic pattern of regulation, then, and only then, you begin the second phase. Now you start paying attention to the places in your life where you're experiencing the most resistance, or the most apparent laziness, or the most sense that you should be doing something, but can't seem to generate the motivation. Write these down. Don't judge them. Don't try to fix them yet. Just notice them. You're collecting information. Where are you forcing yourself? Where are you trying to make yourself want something? Where is your system communicating that something needs to change? Once you've identified these areas, you're going to go back to basics and ask yourself the fundamental question that Michael asked. What would need to be different about this situation for me to actually want to do this? Not, how can I make myself want it? But, what would need to be true for this to be something I genuinely wanted to do? Sometimes the answer is structural. You'd need different hours, different people, different conditions. Sometimes the answer is deeper. You'd need to fundamentally reorganize your life in a way that doesn't fit into the current structure. Sometimes the answer is that this thing never actually mattered to you, and you've been trying to make yourself care about something that's fundamentally misaligned. Here's where it gets real. You might discover that your job doesn't actually work for you. You might discover that the way you've been organizing your career isn't aligned with what matters to you. You might discover that your living situation, or your relationship, or your social commitments aren't actually what you want. These are scary discoveries. Your brain will immediately tell you that you can't change these things, that you're stuck, that you should just try harder to want them. But notice what's happening. Notice that your nervous system is finally free enough to tell you the truth. That's not a crisis. That's actually an opening. What you do with that opening is the crucial question, and here's where most people get confused. Having the opening doesn't mean you quit your job tomorrow or blow up your relationship or make dramatic changes. What it means is that you start making small decisions that are more aligned with what's true. Maybe you have a conversation with your boss about your actual capacity and your actual interests. Maybe you suggest a different configuration of your work. Maybe you set a boundary that you've never set before. Maybe you start exploring what actually interests you while still showing up at your current job. Maybe you have a conversation with your partner about what's not working and what you actually need. Maybe you simply start spending your free time differently, doing things that actually interest you instead of things you think you should do. The key is that these changes emerge from a place of nervous system regulation and authentic presence, not from a place of crisis or desperation or trying to fix yourself. When your nervous system is regulated, you can think more clearly. You can see options that weren't visible when you were in a defensive state. You can make decisions that are aligned with what's actually true rather than decisions driven by panic or guilt or shame. You can tolerate the discomfort of change because your system isn't simultaneously fighting for survival. Let me give you a concrete week-by-week progression for the first month. In week 1, you implement one nervous system practice daily. Just the practice, nothing else. In week 2, you add a second practice and continue both daily. In week 3, you maintain both practices and you start writing down the areas where you're experiencing resistance. In week 4, you take one area of resistance and you ask the fundamental question, what would need to be different for this to be something I actually want? You don't have to answer it fully. You just start asking it. You start noticing what comes up. In month 2, you deepen the nervous system practices. Maybe you add a third one, or you extend the time on the ones you're already doing. You continue asking the fundamental question about areas of resistance. You start noticing patterns. Maybe you notice that all the areas of resistance have something in common. Maybe you notice that several of them could be addressed through a single change. Maybe you notice that one area is actually okay once your nervous system is regulated, and the resistance was just your system's way of communicating that you were operating in an unsustainable pattern. What's happening during all of this is that you're not implementing a system. You're not trying to fix yourself. You're not generating motivation. You're rebuilding your relationship with yourself and with your nervous system. You're learning to pay attention to what's actually true. You're learning to trust the signals your body is sending. You're learning that your apparent laziness and your lack of motivation and your resistance to things that should theoretically be good for you. These are all forms of communication from an intelligent system that knows more than your conscious mind does about what's sustainable and what's aligned. The most important thing I can tell you is this: there is no point at which you're done. There's no moment where you finally get it all figured out and then you can relax. But what changes is that the struggle shifts. Instead of struggling to force yourself into a shape that doesn't fit, you're engaged in the ongoing practice of paying attention to what's true and reorganizing your life based on that. That's infinitely more sustainable and infinitely more real than any motivation-driven transformation ever will be. And it gets easier. Your nervous system begins to trust that you're listening. Your body begins to relax because it realizes that you're actually paying attention to what it's communicating. You don't have to do this perfectly. You'll miss days on your nervous system practice, and that's fine. You just start again the next day. You'll encounter moments where you fall back into the old patterns of trying to force yourself or generate motivation. That's fine too. You'll discover things about yourself and your life that are uncomfortable and that you'd rather not face. That's part of the process. But every time you come back to the practices, every time you ask the fundamental questions, every time you choose presence over performance, you're sending a message to your nervous system. I'm listening. I'm paying attention. It's safe to be authentic here. And from that foundation, actual change becomes possible. Start today. Pick one practice. Commit to 7 days. Don't wait until Monday or until you feel motivated or until you figure out the perfect way to do this. Today. Right now. Your nervous system has been waiting for you to finally pay attention to what it's telling you. It's ready. You're ready. The only thing left is to begin. Conclusion. Your journey is just beginning. There's a moment that comes after you've read something meaningful and absorbed its logic and understand what it's suggesting that you do. A moment where you're standing at the threshold of actually applying it. And you feel the weight of that decision. You might feel doubt. You might feel uncertainty about whether this will actually work for you. You might feel the pull of familiar patterns, the comfort of doing things the way you've always done them, the safety of not trying, because if you don't try, you can't fail. That moment is the most important moment. That's where the actual decision gets made. What I want to tell you at this threshold is that everything you've read in this book has been leading to a single realization. You are not broken. Your motivation didn't disappear because something fundamental went wrong with you. Your apparent laziness isn't a character flaw. Your inability to sustain external systems isn't evidence of your weakness. Your resistance to your current life structure isn't something to overcome. It's information. Your nervous system has been speaking to you for a long time, and it's finally speaking loud enough that you can hear it. The question now is whether you're going to listen. Listening doesn't require heroic action. It doesn't require you to overhaul your entire life overnight or make dramatic declarations or commit to some new system that you'll follow religiously. Listening simply requires attention. It requires you to spend 5 minutes with your feet on the ground and notice what your body is telling you. It requires you to hum and notice how your nervous system responds. It requires you to ask yourself honest questions about what's actually aligned and what's actually true. These are small things, but small things, done consistently, compound into transformation. What Michael discovered, and what you're about to discover if you actually apply this material, is that the second half of life doesn't have to be a slow decline into resignation and maintenance. It can be an opening. The crisis of motivation failing, the exhaustion that comes from decades of pushing yourself forward, the flat emptiness of realizing that what you built doesn't actually fit you. These can all be doorways. Not because they're pleasant, but because they finally create enough space for something real to emerge. The culture you live in is going to tell you that you need more motivation, more discipline, more willpower. You're going to see people who appear to have figured it out, who seem to be thriving in their 40s and 50s. And you're going to wonder what they have that you don't. Some of them have better genetics, or better circumstances, or more financial security. But many of them, more than you'd think, have simply made the decision that Michael made. They've stopped trying to force themselves into a shape that doesn't fit. They've started paying attention to what's actually true. They've organized their lives around presence instead of performance. That choice is available to you, not in some distant future when you've figured everything out. Now, today, with whatever job you currently have, whatever relationship you're currently in, whatever circumstances you're currently living in, you can begin the practice of nervous system regulation. You can begin asking yourself honest questions about what's aligned and what's not. You can begin reorganizing small pieces of your life around what actually matters. These things won't solve all your problems. Life doesn't work that way. But they will change the quality of your presence in whatever life you're living. They will give your nervous system permission to finally relax. They will create space for authentic engagement to emerge naturally instead of requiring you to force it through motivation and willpower. The temptation right now is to close this book and think about it for a while. To tell yourself that you'll start the practices next week or after you finish another project or once the circumstances are better. Don't do that. That's the familiar pattern reasserting itself. That's the voice telling you to wait until you feel ready or until conditions are perfect. Conditions will never be perfect. You will never feel completely ready. The moment you're standing in right now, this moment where you've absorbed the information and you're beginning to understand it, this is the moment to begin. Pick one practice. The grounding exercise, the humming, the co-regulation, the interoception, or the pendulation. Pick the one that feels most accessible. Commit to doing it every single day for 7 days. That's all you have to do right now. 7 days. One practice. Notice what shifts. Notice how your nervous system responds. Notice what becomes possible when you stop trying to force yourself and start paying attention to what your body's asking for. What's true for you at 45 or 50 or 60 is that you have something that younger people don't have. You have the lived experience to know what's real and what's not. You can distinguish between what you actually want and what you think you should want. You have enough evidence from your own life to know whether the current structure is working. You have enough wisdom accumulated to recognize that forcing yourself forward at any cost is no longer a viable strategy. These aren't weaknesses. These are superpowers. They're the capacity to finally live authentically instead of continuing to perform. The second half of your life doesn't belong to the culture's definition of success or to productivity systems or the endless pursuit of optimization. It belongs to you, to what actually matters to you, to what creates genuine engagement, to what allows you to be present and real instead of defended and performing. That possibility isn't in some future transformation or some distant goal you'll reach when everything is finally figured out. It's available now, in the small, consistent practices that tell your nervous system it's safe to relax, it's safe to be authentic, it's safe to be real. Michael's journey isn't finished, and neither is yours. He didn't reach some endpoint where he finally figured it all out and now he coasts. What shifted was that the quality of his life changed fundamentally because he stopped trying to fix himself and started paying attention to what was actually true. That same shift is available to you, not because you need fixing or because you're broken or lazy, but because somewhere inside you, your nervous system has been trying to tell you the truth and you're finally in a position to hear it. Your journey is just beginning because you're about to start listening to yourself, and everything changes from there.